And they said, no, we're going to show your body and we're going to put it in like crystal caskets and we're going to make it a tourist attraction.
So let's talk about dead bodies.
Oh, wow. You had that. Did you have that ready? Before we get going, it is a huge help. If you enjoy this episode at all and you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe or give us a like. Chat with us down below. All that stuff helps us make content like this. It means a lot to us. And obviously, if we can keep doing this and you're enjoying it, then I think everybody wins.
Yep. So hit the like button, hit subscribe. And if you really want us all in your business, hit the notification bell and then you'll get notified every time we make a new video.
Today's going to be a bit of a macabre episode. We're going to be, well, the inspiration to this was we watched the documentary, what's it called?
Love Has Won.
Love Has Won.
So HBO recently came out with a documentary on Amy Carlson and her cult, Love Has Won. Spoiler alert, Amy Carlson died and the members of Love Has Won kept her body and traveled a portion of the country with said body. Yeah, well, and then like they did things to it, which would be sort of a funeral rite in ways, although they were apparently under the delusion that she was still alive or something. Sure.
Yeah.
So a big question, I think, for a lot of people is this legal? Wow, this seems
strange.
Not normal.
Certainly is strange.
And then I think you and I both kind of had the thought of like, yeah, but like, how is this that much different from like standard wake processes, mummies that we have on display at museums?
Like abnormal mourning processes,
right.
Really, yeah.
Like, what do we do to bodies after people die and why?
Should we do a warning like, we might show some images that are relatively graphic. It's not going to be like any fresh dead bodies, but we're going to show preserved bodies in this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a bit of a warning. If you don't want to see that, move along. But it's not going to be anything more grotesque than going to a museum and looking at a mummy. These things are on display, basically. Yeah.
So I think today we're going to be talking about a whole broad range of topics, all related to what happens to people after they die and how are their bodies used in different cultures and different types of procedures for preservation, whether that's short term for like pre-funeral procedures or long term.
Yeah, and we're going to tie it back down to the cult and Amy Carlson thing at the end, but we have to, I feel like, go through quite a few points before we get there.
Yep.
Yeah, all right.
It'll come full circle.
First thing that I got thinking is that it's strangely normal that people like pay money or congregate to spaces to look at dead bodies. And some of these bodies are incredibly, incredibly old. Some of the oldest bodies on display are, well, actually you can't see Ötzi the Iceman, I don't think. Ötzi is kept behind. He's like in a freezer somewhere. A lot of people know about Ötzi the Iceman. You can do a whole episode on him, but he was a body that was found in the Alps, I think between Austria and Italy, and he died around 3000 BC, so that'd be like 5,000 years ago. But actually the oldest human remains ever found are about like 200,000 years old. You're talking just like skeletal bits, and those are probably in a museum somewhere. But it's hard to, a lot of people wouldn't call like skeletons of like barely Homo sapiens like the same sort of thing. It's a museum display more than it is like showing a dead body.
It's not necessarily like a preserved body.
Yeah.
I think like the interest from the Amy Carlson thing for me was more around like preservation. So whether that's natural, whether that's synthetic, like why? And also the fact that it wasn't buried then. So before we go there, though, like some of the most famous examples of preserved bodies, and what they called Amy Carlson was mummified. So we got mummies that come from all over the world. Some of the most famous examples are the Egyptian mummies. There are mummies older than King Tut, but we're going to talk about King Tut very briefly just because King Tut's probably the most famous mummified body of all time. It was partly because King Tut's tomb was found intact, and it had all the treasure, and like apparently there's a lot of lore around it, like the people that opened it got sick or whatever. It came up. It sort of is like the basis for all these ideas of like of tombs being booby trapped, when in reality it was probably like a sort of mold or something that like infected some of the people. But it created this like massive like lore thing in people's minds about like the dangers of going into like ancient tombs. So King Tut is actually like paraded around the world and is like King Tut's here for like the next like 6 months or something. Like buy a ticket, come look at his body.
So, like, that is, like, and people go in droves to see King Tut's, like, sarcophagus. And I don't know if you actually get to see his, like, mummified body, but, like, all but.
And it's it's a huge pull, I think, for a lot of museums. I can remember as a kid when they had exhibits and they had mummies in whatever museum we were going to.
I've probably seen a mummy,
Yeah, there's this, like, sense of excitement that you're going to see the mummy exhibits, when in actuality what you're going to see is preserved
a dead person.
Bodies.
Yeah, a dead person. King Tut is, although one of the most famous mummies, was never meant to be on display. That's the thing about a lot of these Egyptian mummies, is it was a funeral rite, and then they were buried, sealed away, oftentimes with elaborate. Some of them were actually trapped, like these doorways and stuff that were meant to prevent people from seeing them. So it's a lot different than, like, a body on display. Although we display it, it still shows that kind of morbid curiosity thing.
Yeah.
There are mummies much older than King Tut. Some of them accidental. There's, like, a natural mummification process, and then there's, like, the intentional mummification. Some of the oldest mummies known to exist are I think, like, I found 2 examples. There was the northern Chilean mummies that were found near the Atacama Desert, and I think some of the oldest ones were naturally mummified, but there were ones that were almost as old that were intentionally mummified, and they apparently had all sorts of, like, different types of mummification processes that, again, you could probably spend a whole episode on that we're not going to. Did you read some of that?
I did.
Okay.
I read an entire article. So there's an article that actually the NIH put out. It's interesting because, like, the National Institute of Health, you wouldn't think would write an academic article on mummification, and I guess they didn't really, but they wrote an article about, like, kind of the origins of embalming, because medical students use cadavers as a part of their teaching, and
they're technically embalmed, right? Mm-hmm. Or you would call embalming is just, like, preservation of the body, effectively.
Yep. Okay. It's the act of preserving the body. So they've been embalmed, and this article went into great detail about all of the different methods of embalming, and there are a lot. And even now, there's not, like, one commonly accepted way to embalm an individual, like, their body, that works the best. And then even in cases, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but so Lenin is still on display, and he's kind of continually
Vladimir Lenin
embalmed. Yeah. And they're very secretive about the way in which they do this. It's almost like everybody has their own kind of, like, proprietary
embalming process.
Right, like, combination of chemicals, and there's some that are, like, well known to do certain things and are kind of commonly used, but the percentages they're used in are different depending on the person.
And based on what we started with talking here is that, like, these are things that have been perfected for thousands of years. So the oldest embalming processes we know of are about, like, 7,000 to 9,000 years old. I read that the Chinchiro mummies and of course the Egyptian mummies talked about how a lot of these soft organs were removed before the embalming process. So I read some of these processes involved like stripping off the skin, removing limbs, and then preserving them individually and reattaching them and rebuilding the body, basically, which is like. I've always heard of the thing of, like, putting the hook in the nose to pull out the Egyptian mummy brains, but like the Chilean mummies really got weird with the dismembering, rebuilding kind of thing, which was something I hadn't heard before.
You kind of have to, in what I was reading about the embalming process.
Well, especially with the old school methods, right?
Well, and even now.
Oh yeah.
It's really important to remove, like, organs, blood, anything that could allow microbes to exist or insects to thrive. And despite the fact that a lot of the traditional embalming methods now use some pretty heavy chemicals, there are still some flies that can live in the presence of those chemicals. So it's really, really important to remove anything that could result in decomposition.
Which is also notably something that they didn't go into the documentary, Love Has Won, but something that didn't occur. And so there's some, like, messed up ramifications I'm sure you can imagine around that wasn't talked about in the documentary. But not a lot of people are mummified anymore. I suppose maybe there are some people that do that, but we didn't really look into that too much.
When I was looking up stuff about this, one of the articles that came up for me was a PopSci article about kind of all of the different ways that you could possibly preserve someone's body.
Just in case you're in the need to know.
In case you want that kind of information. But some of it comes off of what we were talking about, which is embalming. And I think that's probably the most common thus far. And then it also went into a couple of different techniques for preserving a body, one of which is called plastification.
Okay.
What happens is it's very similar to embalming, only when they pull out the and they use some kind of specialized technique to do this that, I mean, I'm not a scientist, I don't work in this field, so I'm not the expert here, but they basically like push all of the like blood and natural body fluid out of your body, and then it gets replaced by polymer plastic. And that's where, if you've ever seen, a lot of museums will have kind of the traveling exhibit called Bodies.
Yeah, that's the thing I was talking about. Yeah.
And they'll have bodies in different positions. They can pose them.
And often with like parts of their body removed, so you can see like the interior workings, like the muscle structure.
Right.
Or like the arteries and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's from plastification.
Okay.
So it's almost like embalming, only...
Saran wrapping it?
Kind of.
Almost? Because, I mean, it's like liquid, but
inside
like,
out, too.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? So the people essentially become plastic.
You're coated totally from inside and out,
Yeah. So plastification actually prevents, like, any of the decomposition that you'd worry about with embalming, and you still have to worry about it. Embalming is not like a one-and-done kind of thing. Yeah. It's like a continual maintenance situation. Or when you embalm someone, if your plan is for them to remain embalmed and not decompose, there's maintenance involved in doing that. With plastification, not so much.
It's like you airtight seal it, so then it's like there's no room for, if there's no air, there's nothing. Yeah. That's like if you had a body in space, it's not going to decompose because there's no system for that to happen.
Right.
It's an aerobic thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like completely changed from that point forward.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It's super creepy to think about because when you look up pictures of what plastification looks like, it really doesn't look human anymore. I mean, it's like Uncanny Valley almost, looking at bodies and body parts that have been through the plastification process.
Yeah, even though it's actually beyond that, though, because it is real. But then it's been manipulated in a way that it makes it seem kind of bizarre. Yeah.
Embalming, on the other hand, is a situation where you're putting like formaldehyde and some other kind of solution. Normally,
I read chloroform sometimes.
Sometimes there's like a huge, massive, long list of all these different chemicals that can be involved. Like when it was kind of in its infancy in Europe, after having been, like, some of the procedures were taken from people in, like, Russia and other places that were experimenting with embalming. When it came to Europe, they were using arsenic as part of the like, mixture.
It's like lead in the paint.
Yeah, right? Mercury sometimes was part of it. So there were a lot of just really...
Mercury also used in hat making. I wonder if there's a relation there.
I don't know.
Okay.
But basically, the goal is to dry everything out. So they use alcohol. Okay. And then the formaldehyde replaces, like, your body fluids, and that prevents rotting from the fluid that would have, like, bacteria in it that would be able to survive and then start breaking down your corpse. But the problem with that is that alcohol is drying. Okay. So if you want to preserve someone and have them look like what they looked like when they were alive, you have
like desiccated, basically. Right. Even though it's wet, alcohol will suck out the liquid. Yes. Yeah.
Then you have to add moisture. Okay. And when you add moisture, then you breed bacteria.
Okay.
So it's this
like balance.
Like, like delicate balance that they have to constantly maintain for anyone that they're embalming, that they want to be embalmed long term.
Yeah.
And people like that, and I'm sure we'll go into it, but like Vladimir Lenin was embalmed and is still being maintained. And that
one of many heads of state, actually, that has been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that requires a team of people to maintain. And then it requires not only, like, daily processes, but it requires more involved, like, every several year processes.
So, like, an intense touch-up kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I had read that because their goal with Lenin was to preserve as much of his physical appearance as possible.
Do you want to keep this with Lenin?
Well, it's related to this. But they almost, like, are merging the embalming technique with plastification because they've replaced pieces of him with polymer-based material in an effort to preserve things. because
at least
otherwise
have the
they wouldn't be able
appearance of
to.
preservation too.
Yeah.
Like that's an important part of that.
Right. So those are the two kind of main ways that have been used. And then there's a third one that's pretty interesting that hasn't really been used to preserve anyone that they're like showing on a regular basis. But essentially, they're trying to use like cryogenics to.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Like
so
some
it's
famous
like,
people, not famous, but like wealthy people, like cryogenically froze their bodies in an effort to hopefully come back to life one day or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about that, about cryopreservation, is that they have been able to successfully see animals that have been frozen, and then they've been able to show that when those animals are unfrozen and then like come back to life, that they retain memory from pre-freezing.
Like frogs and stuff. Like okay, there are certain animals that do that regularly.
The idea is that if you were able to freeze someone and then you could cure whatever ailment it was that led to their death, that then you could like bring them back to life.
It wouldn't just be like a clone, it would be that person returned.
Yeah.
Which is science fiction, but who knows?
Sure.
Theoretically possible.
Theoretically
if you
possible.
froze a person well enough and you had the technology in the future.
And that's the issue, is freezing them well enough. So apparently human tissue functions very differently than a lot of the small animals that they've been able to freeze and thaw effectively. Yeah. And it's especially brain tissue just does not react well to it.
For one thing, it's mostly water, right?
Yes.
And then
and
so
that's
like
the problem.
like you freeze anything in the like meat that has a high water content, it's gonna break down.
Right.
That's the same thing happening to your brain structure.
Yeah. So they've tried some methods to get around this, like slow freezing when they're like freezing the body for the first time, doing that slowly, having like high temperature regulation, but I don't think they're anywhere near a place where they could thaw someone out and then have that function effectively.
Okay.
So
that's cool.
Yeah, super.
Thank you for diving down that rabbit hole.
Super interesting deep dive into all the ways that you could be preserved. I think intentionally and with a lot of intervention, because we'll talk a little bit later about some people that have been mummified where this stuff didn't happen and it functioned differently to this. But those are kind of like the three main ways that you do it if you wanted to preserve a body for like long term.
Put that in your cap in case you need it. I don't know.
You really never know when you're going to need this information, you know?
So one of the other parts that I found fascinating about the Love As One documentary is how attached the people were to the body. They didn't just put it on display they didn't just like try and like keep her around. They were there. Some of them were with her the entire time, and they would visit her regularly. It kind of got me thinking about this idea of visitations. Like, I've been to a few funerals. Anybody watching this that has, or not even funerals, but like wakes or viewings in particular, is the hard part for a lot of people. And that's because you're going to see the body. And that's a normal practice in a lot of like European traditions. It's a largely Christian tradition. Actually, people that don't do viewings, there aren't viewings in Islam because it is a tradition that you want to bury the body as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So you don't have time, basically. Put the body in the ground. That's important. And then there isn't viewings in a lot of Jewish tradition. For one, they don't believe in embalming, and they don't believe in like mourning or like comforting each other in before the funeral's over. And it's more complicated perhaps than that. But I read something about how it's like after the funeral, then you attend to each other's needs and stuff. There's almost like they also believe that as soon as the person dies, the spirit leaves the body. Whereas like you were talking about like in some Catholic tradition where it's like preservation or like holding that body's important. You don't want to cremate it or anything like that because it's almost like a vessel that could be brought back.
Yep.
You don't believe that in all traditions. But a lot of like I would say like any funeral I've been to has kind of fit the mold of like a basic Christian burial in that there's a viewing. And the viewing is if the body isn't disfigured or maimed from traumatic injury, it's put on display. And there's a day or 2 days or so, usually just one day, where people come and pay their respects. There are a lot of reasons for this. One is to like confirm somebody's dead. Another is to there could be some like spiritual things around it, like warding off evil, like watching the dead, kind of protecting them as they travel on to the next life. And then also a lot of like cultural reasons we do this, which includes like psychological stuff. Yeah. There's some discussion about whether or not it's actually psychologically healthy to view the dead body, but it's thought that like viewing it and confirming for yourself that the person's dead allows you to move on. It allows you to say your last respects. It also is a thing right here. It's a thing that potentially promotes like social cohesion and the emotional well-being of the people that have lost a loved one. Because if you think about a viewing, a lot of people will come around and support the people that have lost somebody. So it could be like a bit of a political moment for people to come by and like kind of pay the respects, you know, and say hi to the family. It might be you coming by to like bring baked goods or something and support the people that have lost somebody.
Yeah, so like a community event.
Yeah, and some cultures treat it more like a celebration of life too. I read there was a blurb on what I was reading about like Irish wakes. In Irish tradition, you kind of almost like have like a celebratory element where there could be like a lot more festive type stuff going on, and there are a lot of other traditions that do that as well. I've been to a few, not fun personally, and but it's also like I kind of get that like it doesn't stay with me so much. It's like, okay, like
I guess I've been to one wake, and it felt like a healthy experience.
Yeah.
I was terrified of it beforehand because I was really scared to see a dead body, but in fact, I think it like brought me peace in a weird way to see this person I cared about and then realize that it wasn't them.
I've heard a lot of people say that where it's like it no longer looks like them. When you see a dead body, oftentimes it doesn't feel like them anymore. No, it isn't. I can think about that from my pets. I can think about that from people.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't seem like them anyway. It's a way you're like they're gone. You know? And and apparently, although some people do regret it, the vast majority of people in studies say that they don't regret going to a viewing to see a body.
And I definitely feel that way. And I guess mine was a situation where it was someone who was young. It was an unexpected, like, tragic event. So I think for a lot of people that couldn't, like myself included, that couldn't really process that it had happened.
That was shocking.
Because it was so shocking, it was especially helpful in that circumstance.
Another interesting thing I saw was that they said that this process potentially predates human existence, meaning that, like, our pre-Homo sapien ancestors probably had some sort of funeral rites. And speaking of, there's a lot of evidence that this stuff occurs in the animal world. So to think that like pre-human like apes did this makes perfect sense. But they've observed in crows apparently will gather to observe the dead. They'll kind of stand around, look at it. They won't touch it. So crows are also super intelligent. Like I don't know if you've ever watched videos of crows figuring out puzzles and stuff. Smart. They're very social, which is I think part of it, and they're very smart. Elephants, I think a lot of people kind of have this like maybe you've heard of it before, but elephants will mourn the dead. There's like they'll visit bones of dead elephants. I read this one example of an elephant that died, and although the elephants would go away at night when like even like predators would come and like feed on the carcass basically, but the elephants would come back during the day or stay within view, and like elephants that weren't even part of the family would like pay their respects. Yeah. So there's like a mourning process with elephants for sure.
They say that about pets too. That like if you have multiple pets and one pet dies, that it can be helpful, if possible, to like let the other pets see the pet that has passed, because it helps them like understand what happened, process it, and then be able to move on versus just like this pet's never here again.
Disappearance or something. Yeah, especially for like bonded animals.
Yeah,
I think that's important. Yeah. And then also there were some examples of like dolphins apparently had some like, because dolphins are, again, it seems to be social animals. These animals have high social intelligence and just intelligence in general. Like apparently there's some examples of dolphins like kind of like protecting bodies. There's one example of a female dolphin that died and there were two males that were circling around so much so that the people that are trying to get the dolphin's body like removed, maybe it was in an area they didn't want like the rod or whatever,
right.
They couldn't even get to it because the male dolphins were protecting it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. Also, one of our closer relatives, chimpanzees, apparently kind of go in an opposite direction where they often try to maintain normalcy. And this is kind of sad, but and also kind of weird, but it also really relates to this documentary and the way they treated it, honestly. Not to say anything like negative and associate them with chimpanzees, but it's interesting reading this. It's a totally flip side on it. They almost like pretend it isn't dead sometimes.
Yeah.
Particularly with like a mother, if they lose an infant chimpanzee, sometimes they'll carry it around for days, weeks, or even months. Some researchers recorded one example in Zambia where a mother would return to the 4-month-old, like virtually non-existent body of her dead infant. And yeah, so it's very, like there's a strong natural tendency to like view a body or like mourn a dead family member.
That like moves pretty, I don't know if you're ready to move into it, but that like transitions well into the tribe in Indonesia.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So in kind of like the center of Indonesia, there's this tribe called the Turanhan people, and it's actually a lot of people. It's like 1.1 million people.
Okay, so it's a large group.
It's big. I'm not sure that all of them participate in these funeral rituals, so I don't want to say that that's true.
Yeah.
But
this is a method that a lot of people practice there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quite a few people practice interesting rituals around their dead relatives and family members.
Okay.
So one of the things that's kind of like, it's shocking, I think, for people that aren't part of this cultural group, but not so shocking when you talk about chimpanzees and how they treat sometimes their dead. Yeah. And I apologize if I'm saying the name. I'm sure I'm saying the name of this tribe incorrectly, but just I'm doing the best I can here. But the Turahan people, they prepare heavily for like the death of their relatives, to the point where it's like one of the most important things that they do. It's the thing that they spend the most money on. I mean, they sometimes in excess of like 20,000-30,000 US dollars on like the funeral and death rates for someone. And then partially because of that, how expensive it is, and then partially because of tradition, often people will die and they will not bury the body of the person for weeks, months, years sometimes.
Okay.
And they just hold their bodies in another room in the house.
So it's like while you're sleeping, you have like your relative in the other room?
Yeah, and they actually, they call the people sick, not dead.
Okay.
And they treat them like they're sick, not
Reminds
dead.
me a lot of Love Has Won.
Yeah, it's
that's
very similar
Yeah.
to the Amy Carlson situation, but so they actually continue to do things like try and feed the dead people, like take care of them, all in preparation for this kind of like lavish funeral ceremony that they'll have sometimes years later.
Which, I just want to say something really quick. You say like they try and feed them and care for them, which again sounds weird to maybe Westerners, but that's a normal thing to like bring food or bring like items to the grave sites of deceased people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like people like you give it and the spirit will take it or whatever, but that's not that different from what a lot of us are used to.
Yep. And then this tribe, the other kind of interesting thing is once they bury them, they don't stay buried, so they dig people back up.
I may have heard, now that you're saying this, I may have heard about this before. Yeah.
So like somewhat annually, I guess,
Okay.
they would, or every couple of years, they would dig the body back up and then clean it. So like remove insects that are on the body. Sometimes like there's a picture of someone giving one of the bodies a cigarette.
Oh, like here's a smoke, like it's been a while, like kind of thing.
The person like cigarettes in their.
It's like caring for somebody.
Yeah. And then a lot of the interviews that I watched with, because this is very interesting to outsiders.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have gone there to try and understand a little bit more like culturally about why they're doing this. And a lot of the people there were saying things like they're not afraid of the dead, and the fact that their bodies are there like allows them to kind of continue to include them in like their day-to-day.
Well, at that point, it's very normalized in this culture too. Whereas, like a lot of Americans are afraid of seeing dead bodies because you basically never see them except for at a funeral when everybody's crying. If they're living in the other room next to you, you're probably like, okay, I'm gonna go say hi to Grandpa or something,
Yeah, it's very interesting. And then what you were saying about people getting sick, when they would kind of unearth Egyptian mummies, a lot of the people, when they're unearthing their dead relatives, they'll wear face masks to protect themselves.
Because they've probably encountered stuff like that where they don't want to catch things or whatever.
I don't know if it's for, it's just for
Could be a ritual thing too.
Health and like protection and things like that. But yeah, really, really interesting and very different from the way that we treat our dead in the U.S.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
I feel like that's another thing you can just go down a rabbit hole on.
That I will say, it's incredibly, there's a lot more, like the intricacies of this culture and the way that they treat funerals and death is very, very interesting. And this is only
This is a scratch in the surface, yeah.
This is only one of the things that's interesting about it. So honestly, we could probably talk for an hour just about this particular Indonesian group of people. But I think I'll leave it there.
We don't have that kind of time because we still haven't even gotten to lying in state. So I'm going to go actually pretty quick through this.
Because this is similar, right? Like, lying in state is similar to what's going on with the tribe in Indonesia, just
in a way,
a little bit more like pomp and circumstance,
and less like, so lying in state and lying in, there's a term called lying in honor as well. Lying in state is when it's a political figure, so you've held office, you're a governor, usually it's just like a president or something, or the queen lied in state, like that's you're part of the government basically. Lying in honor is if you're just like a plebeian like you or me. There were some people, I think like Rosa Parks lied in honor. So you're displaying your body. It's almost like you're an important part of the government or the cultural zeitgeist or something. You know what I mean? Like Pope John Paul II had his body displayed for a period of time. These are all temporary things, though, where I didn't read the origins of this or why, but there's almost like a political element that I'm reading from this where it's like a transference of power. It's a remembrance of the people that have created the institutions that you view it as important. And I imagine like you have like a president die, and then you have all the current living and current and former presidents come by and visit the body, pay their respects, kind of thing. There's like a political element to that. Interestingly, a lot of presidents in the United States have lied in state. One that wasn't was Nixon. And they said because they thought it might become like a political thing, basically. So it's not like everybody gets the treatment. You know, there's political elements to this, certainly. Yeah. Otherwise, they'd be giving it to everybody.
Yeah. And this is short, right?
Yeah. Oh, you mean short term?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's just for like a couple of days. It's not that different from a wake. It's just a little more official. It's like a government-sanctioned viewing.
Because there are a lot of people who would want to view those people, so it's like to give them all enough time to be able to do that.
And I think they're often not displayed. Like in a viewing, you will see the body. I think oftentimes when you're lying, not always, but oftentimes when you're lying in state, you're in the casket. Henry Clay was the first person in the U.S., which is shortly before Abraham Lincoln was like the second person in the U.S. to lie in state. And they have like an area where they do that. Like I said, other important people in other countries, like Elizabeth II, lied in state. But where this gets a little weird is when they never stop showing the bodies. And we talked several times about Vladimir Lenin. He's been displayed since 1924.
He's probably one of the most commonly recognized political figures that people know of that is still lying and like is still being held.
But there were others that I was surprised by, and there's a common thread here. It's not maybe I missed some that wouldn't fit this thread, but other people that have been apparently displayed since their deaths are Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Mao Zedong, and obviously Vladimir Lenin. They're all from communist countries. And I think this kind of goes back to that idea of like lying in state being sort of a political reference.
Yeah.
And potentially, I didn't see this written anywhere, but I'm thinking like these are following the tradition of Lenin as well, which is like, you know, the forefather of Marxism was preserved and displayed. And then in order to like maintain that consistency, that like pride and heritage, I'm thinking Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong probably did as well. And actually, at least in the case of Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong, directly against their wishes. Vladimir Lenin...
So rude.
It is. Vladimir Lenin said he wanted to be buried with his mother in St. Petersburg, and Mao Zedong said he wanted to be cremated. And they said, no, we're going to show your body, and we're going to put it in like crystal caskets, and we're going to make it a tourist attraction.
Do you know what I read, though?
It's interesting.
I read that it's true that this happens with a lot of communist leaders because often communism is like a revolutionary political state, and they're worried that if you lose that leader and the connection to the leader, that the movement will also go with them.
It's also, in at least in the case of Vladimir and probably Mao Zedong too, is there the communist movements that were also atheist and anti-religious. And Vladimir Lenin, it is thought by some people that the displaying of the body harkens back to the idea of incorruptibility in Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, which we'll get into in a second. But it's almost like this reference to religion. Religion is kind of like, we don't do that anymore here because it's a communist country. But then you're almost like pulling out parts of it and being like, well, Vladimir Lenin is in a way incorruptible. Interestingly enough, with Vladimir Lenin, he apparently was just displayed naturally for 2 months after his death, and his body was really well preserved because it was Russia.
Yeah,
in winter, it's cold, so his body wasn't decaying. In a way, it was almost incorruptible at that moment because it was naturally not decaying, and they didn't try to preserve it until several months later. They decided, like you're saying, like, oh, we kind of need him for the ongoing revolution. Let's fix him up.
Because I didn't read any, and I mean, I know we're going to talk about incorruptibility, but I didn't read anything anywhere insinuating that anyone thought that these communist leaders had incorruptible bodies by just the nature of their bodies existing. I don't know if you did.
I didn't see that either, but I think the Lenin example is a pull from incorruptibility, which maybe we should just go right into. So incorruptibility is this idea in largely Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition that is basically like a person who was typically a religious person. They're already like a priest or a nun or something like that. They've maybe done good works. They might not be a saint yet, but when they die, if their body doesn't decay, that it's a sign that they are blessed, basically, that they are a saint, that they are special, like divinely prevented from rotting.
And not always their whole body, too.
Which I didn't read this. But
so sometimes it can just be pieces of their body that don't decay as you would expect them to decay.
And that's an important thing. It's not that they will never decay. It's like in these circumstances, you'd expect this person to already be falling apart, but instead it's not. So that's a sign of incorruptibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about any specific examples, or do you not have any?
I do. Yeah.
Saint Anthony.
So Saint Anthony, I think, is a very interesting instance of incorruptibility.
Based on the timing, too, I had a couple of other examples, but maybe one of the oldest incorruptible bodies that we still have displayed.
Right. So he died in 1231, and his body was exhumed because he was going to be reburied. And his whole, like, everything was decomposed. His flesh was gone. I mean, he'd been buried for a while at this point, but his tongue wasn't.
Oh, that's weird.
And he was known for, like, his preaching or proselytizing.
Okay.
So
the holy tongue.
Right.
Okay.
So the Catholic Church viewed this as an instance of incorruptibility of his tongue, and it's almost like it was given more significance because it was his tongue, and it was known that he had this gift for preaching. Super bizarre, interesting to me.
The other oldest person that I saw, Saint Zita, was also from the 1200s. So it sounds like sometime around these 1200s there are a couple of bodies, and she was also exhumed later.
Yeah.
So she was exhumed in like 1580. When they dug her up, she was like, wow, she's really not that decayed. So then they're like, she must be a saint or something like that. So, well, she is a saint, Saint Zita. But yeah, so like, well, I mean, you think about Europe, and a lot of it's really crowded, and you've got these grave sites, and you're gonna move a casket or something, you open it up, and you're like, holy crap, look at that.
Yeah.
This person isn't even decayed. Kind of reminds me of like the myths around vampires and stuff in a way, but it's like from a holy perspective instead of like from a vampiric perspective.
Yeah. It's I think the incorruptibility thing is like very interesting to me because it's hard. My immediate feeling is that there has to be some kind of scientific explanation for why this would happen, and or people are not telling the truth.
Yeah, well, so and I think all these people are referencing Saint Zita. There's Saint Rita of Cassica, who died in 1457. There's Saint Anthony. These bodies are all displayed. You can go to like a cathedral or like a certain place and like see the bodies still today.
Yeah.
And some of them are in quite a state of decay at this point. I don't know how much of it has been like preserved and stuff. There's like that element of like, what are people not saying?
But then the weird part for me reading about incorruptibility is that it's all based on like the point at which they found the body.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's like, did you read about Saint Bernadette of Lourdes?
No.
So she was exhumed 3 times after her death, and each time they exhumed her, they found no evidence that she was decomposing.
That's interesting.
So the like myth around her is that every time they exhumed her, she looked the same. Like 0 signs of decomposition.
Is that a picture of her right there?
Yeah.
Because in the picture, she looks like a living body, and that just makes me, not a living, a recently deceased body, and that makes me think, like, what's going on here?
So,
you know?
okay, so it's interesting because she is, I think, on display now, and the last time she was exhumed, I think, was in 1933. Well, that's when she was canonized.
And
I think
then
that's
put in a crystal coffin.
Right, and that was like 40 years after she died.
Okay.
And then their argument was that at that point she still even had like pale skin.
Yeah.
Like there was just nothing about her was decomposed. But then they exposed her to air, and that caused her skin to turn black.
Which is the same. Lenin's skin apparently also started to turn splotchy and stuff, and they had to do stuff to preserve it.
Which is a clear sign of decomposition. Yeah. But their argument is that when they opened her burial site, that's not what it was. And then they've done something. I think she's covered in wax. To like preserve the look of her.
That's interesting. So then it's like, it's back to that idea of like when you would expect them to be more decayed, and they weren't, so therefore it's incorruptible. And it doesn't mean impervious. It doesn't mean invincible. It means like not as decayed as you'd expect. Yes. It's a weird concept.
Right. And then I read somewhere that someone was criticizing the Catholic Church, saying like they had viewed these bodies and it was clear that you could see like wax and like wrinkles on the person's face, whatever. And then the Catholic Church's response to this has largely been, we're not telling you that we're not doing things now to preserve the bodies. What we're telling you is at the time we found them, they were deemed to be incorruptible because of the state that we found them in, which is what we are now trying to preserve.
It's not a bad argument, honestly. And it's like I'm not a faithful person, but like I kind of, that's not a terrible way to explain it. I did read a weird example of one incorruptible body. It was Saint Rita, actually, one of the oldest. They say that here's a quote I saw, there is yet another mystical event related to the incorruptible body. A sweet odor of fragrance is known to emanate constantly from the body of Saint Rita. It's just like weird to me. I don't know what that is. I don't know if they're stuffing her with perfume or something, but like your body shouldn't smell good.
No, decomposition doesn't smell good.
Even an old body, honestly, I would expect it would just be a little musty more than anything. But I
read that that's a sign in general that they take for incorruptibility, is that something smells like sweetness or perfume or something. Okay. Yeah, like has a positive scent.
We're not going too far into that, I think. But I thought that this kind of in a way lends, because Eastern Orthodox was huge in Russia, and then at the time that Lenin was helping like the communist revolution and replacing religion, then it kind of makes sense to me to have that kind of line of thought going from Eastern Orthodox tradition, which this has been going on for hundreds of years at that point, and then suddenly you're like, oh, well, we sort of have an incorruptible body here. Again, not totally, but in a way,
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is that and how much more of it is just that, like, I think there's the fear anytime you have like a counterculture movement that if the face of that movement is no longer around and you don't have a solid replacement for people to latch onto, that the movement will die. Yeah. And I think that fear can drive, like, if there's the body there, it reminds people that that's still like very much alive.
I found it interesting when looking into the idea of Lenin's body, regardless of whether or not you want to say it has a connection to the incorruptibility of like Eastern Orthodoxy. Some people referred to his continued display and worship as a cult of Lenin. Basically, it's like these old dogs, these old kind of callbacks to Russian like communism that isn't really relevant today. Apparently, a lot of people are sort of indifferent to it. Some people really want to keep his body on display. Some people like bury the old guy. You know what I mean? But that idea of like there's a cult around his displayed body.
Do you know what's interesting about that, too? I don't know if you saw this, but Stalin was also...
Yeah.
Joseph Stalin was also embalmed and put on display.
Next to him, I think.
Yeah. And then when there was, like, a period of, like, anti-Stalinism, they decided to, like, take him away.
It was a part of the breakdown of, like, communism in Russia, and then they took his body and buried it.
And the symbol of his body being available for people to look at was, like, too much. Basically, they wanted to break the connection, and to do that, they, like, stopped viewing his body.
Lenin persists.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so are we going to bring it back to the Amy Carlson? So in a way, Amy Carlson is normal, I end up feeling. You know, like normal in the way that humans are really weird. And this happens all over the world.
It's not as strange. Initially, when I saw the documentary, I was kind of horrified by the way that after she died, her cult members... like treated her corpse,
and they show a lot of it in the documentary. It's really one of the first scenes and a bunch of the last scenes are showing her dead body,
right?
Which is very uncomfortable if you're not prepared for that.
And they kind of, I mean, it's very similar to some of the things we read about with animals and then other, like, cultural, like, customs. You talking about the Indonesian custom of, like, feeding the body? They were talking about how she was still breathing. She was still drinking and eating. And you can go into, like, the reasons for that. And people talk about the body, like, making noises or, like, bloating and there's air and all that. So that stuff can happen scientifically. But regardless, that custom of what they were doing is very normal. Yeah. And then the other thing that her group believed was that she was going to be ascended, I guess.
Like, kind of like reincarnated almost, right?
A bit.
Yeah.
And that she was going to be taken away kind of into space by these, like, the Galactic Federation.
The Galactics.
The Galactics.
Yeah.
And I thought, when we were watching that, oh, how unique. Like, I've never heard of this before, but that's actually not true. So there is actually another cult that existed right outside of Moab in Utah, run by this woman named Marie Ogden's, and it was called the Home of Truth.
Which, in a way, just sounds very similar
to Love Has Won.
Yeah.
And it is very similar.
Regionally, it's very similar.
Yeah, and regionally it's similar. And it predates Love Has Won.
Almost... 80 years?
A lot, yeah. So in 1935, a member of this cult named Edith Peshek died of cancer. And Marie Ogden's, the leader of the cult, insisted that she had not died and had in fact transcended into something that they called purification. So Love Has Won calls it ascension,
which is a kind of a common term in, like, modern cults.
Sure. The Home of Truth is calling it purification, and they believed that her spirit was going to be restored into her body,
and maybe she would come back or something.
Yeah. So they began a strange process that is very similar to embalming.
Okay.
Where they were washing her multiple times a day in a saline solution, and then they were replacing her internal fluids with milk.
That sounds bad.
They believed that would, like, feed or, like, nourish her body and preserve her remains.
That last sentence of the first paragraph, we don't need to read out loud.
I think I covered it.
Okay. All right.
And word of what they were doing eventually got out to the greater community. A sheriff came by, and by the time that the sheriff came to the compound, months later, so this woman died in February, the sheriff didn't get there until June, the body was effectively mummified at that point from what they had been doing to her. And it was actually decided that it didn't deem a public health threat, and they could continue.
Do whatever they wanted.
Right.
But the cult no longer exists, right? Long since dissipated.
Yeah, Marie died. I forget when, but she died a long time ago, and after that the cult dissolved, so it doesn't exist anymore. But I just thought it was very interesting. I mean, they were fully convinced that Edith, this woman that died, was going to come back to life. Marie was fully convinced that she was going to go through this state of purification, and, I mean, they doted on the body.
Yeah.
And it was part of their, like, day-to-day life, not so dissimilar from some of the other kind of, like, practices that we've talked about with other cultures and their treatment of the dead.
And seemingly very similar to the Amy Carlson thing.
Very similar.
Wow.
Yeah. I was surprised.
That's So one of the interesting things I found about the documentary that they didn't talk about too was Father God in that documentary. I forgot his name. He had an ankle bracelet on, and they never really explained what that was from. Several people were arrested in that documentary and charged with tampering with a body or like abuse of a body, and I think they dropped all the charges for everybody. They basically similar thing. Like the sheriffs came by, they found the body, they're like, this is weird, and then they were going to charge them with the crimes, and they all got dropped because I think kind of what we're saying here. Like, what crime was committed? Well, you know what I mean? Like, it arguably that they transported a body without being embalmed, if they maybe could have gotten them on that. Right. But their punishment really was being psychologically tortured in their own existence in a way. Like, I don't know. I'm okay with them having gotten off on that. It feels like...
It's strange because I think the laws obviously are going to vary, like, place to place.
Yeah.
But a lot of what I read has to do with more of like the public health risk that it would pose. And once a body is mummified, there's very little public health risk longer in terms of like passing of disease and things like that. And then the other thing that's interesting is you can get charged with like desecration of a corpse.
Yeah.
But in these cases, these people are like doting on the bodies.
Worshipping it, like cleaning it. Like, it's not really desecration if you're tending to it every moment of the day.
I don't get it. I'm still creeped out by the whole thing, but
absolutely.
I also have to wonder, given everything that I read, how much of that is like cultural norms that have been established.
Because any one of these things for me is weird. Honestly, even a viewing for me is kind of weird. But like after going through this journey and seeing all that stuff we read about all these different practices, like it feels so normal compared to what like so many people have done throughout time,
right?
Including animals.
Just it put like the situation with Amy Carlson and the Love Has Won situation into a completely different context. It's definitely strange when you watch the documentary and you realize that people have been sleeping in a tent with her dead body. However, there is an entire group of people in Indonesia that they live in the same home with. They eat right next to the bodies of their deceased relatives.
Yeah.
And for them, it's not weird. Yeah. It's what happens day to day.
It's kind of a mind like, I'm just like, you know, like, so there's so many things in the documentary too to be upset about. Like that whole cult was kind of abusive and really harmful, and they're throwing out a bunch of conspiracies online and saying horrible things about a lot of people.
Sure.
But one of the most shocking things is in a way one of the most normal things too, which is like the way Amy Carlson's body was treated afterwards.
Right.
Yeah, I can't be mad. I don't want to be a part of that. I feel bad for everybody that was, but I can't be mad at them for doing it in a way.
I think for me, it's like, I don't necessarily want to like pass judgment on whether it's right or wrong what they did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know because I'm not a lawyer, and even if I was, you'd have to be very specialized to know what the laws are around how you handle dead bodies in the specific areas that they were in. So I don't know what was legal or illegal and what they did. Sure, but I mean,
it
could
be a precedent thing too, where they don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
For me, I think it's just interesting to be able to look at other ways that other cultures process and have processed their dead, and see that maybe the way that, having grown up in the U.S. and grown up in like largely Christian tradition, it's very different from the way that we view it. And I think that was a really interesting thing. It was an interesting question that came out of watching that documentary, and I think researching it and learning more about the ways that different people deal with their dead and have throughout history was interesting to me.
For sure, same. If there's anything in this episode that you're like you want us to dig into, because there's so many tangents that we can go on, let us know, and we can like maybe we have a bunch of other ideas, but we could do an episode on something if you are really passionate about it, you want to hear about it more.
We'll also include links to some of the sources that we used in the description box below. So if you have an interest in kind of doing your own research, several of the articles that I looked at you could go on a deep dive into all of the articles that helped them create what they wrote. And I mean, the rabbit holes are endless for this kind of thing. But yeah, if there's anything that you want us to look at further, this was interesting.
Yeah, I had fun. Well, thank you for making it this far. If you enjoyed the episode and you want to see more of this, please hit like button, subscribe. It really helps us out if you subscribe. It means we can keep making content like this. And please talk to us if there's anything kind of that you're curious about that you heard here or you want to hear more about. Let us know.
Or do you perhaps participate in a cultural tradition that's different from the ones that we talked about here around the way that you like treat and deal with the death of loved ones? That would be interesting to hear about too.
Yeah, I love it when people share their experiences. I like chatting with people down there too.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And then I got it knocked, and I started going,
ridiculous.
Oh, that was a tearjerker.
Hey, we're going to go on a cruise this summer. You should come with us.